Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. And someone will say his career can never be saved. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage.
Welcome to Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly work my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography. And today we're talking about the 2007 superhero film Ghost Rider. In Ghost Rider, teenage stunt biker Johnny Blaze makes a deal with the demon Mephistopheles in order to cure his father's cancer. The demon holds up his part of the bargain and cures the cancer, but the next day the father dies when his stunt goes wrong, and Mephistopheles tells Johnny that he'll collect his part of the bargain on a later date. Flash forward to a fully grown Johnny Blaze played by Nicolas Cage, who's a successful daredevil now, when Mephistopheles reappears and tasks Johnny with hunting down Mephistopheles' son, and he tells him that if he succeeds he'll give back his soul. And to help him with the task, he gives Johnny the power to transform into a flaming skeleton as he takes on the role of the Ghost Rider. You know, whenever I think about the character Ghost Rider, I always picture some executive in the 1970s going, "You know what boys love? Motorcycles, skulls, and the devil. Put them all together in a comic book and it will be a hit." And it worked. The character Ghost Rider has been in publications spanning decades and has spawned multiple different iterations. And Ghost Rider as a character is pretty iconic at this point. A few weeks ago I was playing the video game Persona 4 for the first time, and up popped a monster that you can summon in it called Hellbiker. I wonder where they got that idea from. The actual conception of the character Ghost Rider seems to have been disputed over the years, with writer Gary Friedrich, Marvel Comics editor-in-chief Roy Thomas, and artist Mike Plug all having different stories about the creation of the character. But I think the story that they all do agree on is that one of them pitched the character to be a villain in a Daredevil comic, and the villain was going to be a motorcycle riding guy called Ghost Rider. But then they realized that that's too awesome of a character to just be a random villain, and that the character should have its own comic book. So on this channel I like to try and do my due diligence, and whenever Nicolas Cage is in a movie that's like a adaptation or a remake, I try and read or watch all of the source material. But the problem is, because we're talking about a comic book character that was created over 50 years ago, there's almost a countless amount of origin stories and successors and reboots and retcons to sift through. Apparently there's even a comic where the Hulk, Venom, and Ghost Rider are all fused together as one guy, which actually sounds pretty badass. But despite my appearance, I'm not really a comic book guy, so I did find it a little overwhelming trying to figure out where to start. What makes it even more confusing is that the very first Marvel comic called Ghost Rider doesn't feature any sort of fire skulls or deals with the devil, or really anything that we associate with the mythos of Ghost Rider as we know it. And the character was later renamed Phantom Rider, I guess to distance him from the Ghost Rider that we know. But what makes it extra confusing is that apparently regular Ghost Rider and this Ghost Rider actually had a crossover at one point. And also Sam Elliott's character in the Ghost Rider movie is somewhat based on this Phantom Rider, right down to sharing the name, Carter Slade. But the very first appearance of the Johnny Blaze Ghost Rider was in an installment of Marvel's Spotlight, which was an anthology comic book series that showcased different characters, and if they proved successful they received their own series. And in issue 5 of Marvel Spotlight, Johnny Blaze made his debut. I read all of his run in Marvel Spotlight, which were issues 5 through 11, and then he eventually got his own series in 1973, which I did not read. But I'm mainly just going to talk about his first appearance, the most supernatural superhero of all, which is pretty impressive considering that at that point the Marvel roster included Doctor Strange and a literal werewolf. This comic covers his origin story, which I'm sure has been tweaked and retconned over the years. But in this version, motorcycle stuntman Barton Blaze, father of Johnny Blaze, dies in a motorcycle accident when Johnny is a kid. He's then adopted by another motorbike stuntman, this Captain Stuttlemeyer from Monk looking dude who brings him into his family, which includes his wife and his daughter called Roxanne. Years later, Johnny Blaze becomes a stunt driver, but his adopted mother dies when Johnny Blaze's motorbike blows up. On her deathbed, she makes him promise to give up the motorcycle life. And when he announces that he's packing it in, he's called a coward by the husband and daughter of the woman that just got killed in a motorbike accident. Which is pretty shitty of them, to be honest. I mean, for some reason that isn't explained, he doesn't tell them about the promise on the deathbed. But even without that, 2 of his parental figures were killed in motorcycle-related accidents. I think that's reasonable enough of an excuse to not want to get back on a motorbike. So then Johnny's adopted father is diagnosed with a terminal illness and he has a month left to live. And Johnny realizes that there's nobody that he can turn to except for Satan. Wait, what? That's seriously exactly how it's presented in the comic book. Johnny Blaze is like, "Oh man, my foster father has cancer. Oh well, of course the only thing I can do is to pull out the old Necronomicon, burn an animal skull, and sit on a pentagram in order to summon Satan." I personally might have contacted another doctor for a second opinion before I contacted Satan, but, you know, that's just me. So the devil says that he'll cure the guy's disease in exchange for a debt from Johnny money that he'll collect later. The foster father gets cured but dies anyway in a motorcycle crash just like in the movie. Then Satan reappears and says it's time to pay up, and that Johnny's gonna be the devil's servant now and has to stay in hell during the day. But then Roxanne scares Satan away somehow, but when night falls, Johnny Blaze is still cursed to turn into the Ghost Rider. And that's how his first appearance ends. I've gotta say, despite the leaps in logic here and there, it's quite an enjoyable read. It's a fun little Faustian tale with elements of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And even some of the 70s corny comic bookiness has its charm. I liked when one of the goons said, "Look, he ran the bike up the plank and now he's jumping right over us." I guess the illustrator couldn't be bothered drawing all of the frames, so they thought, let's just have a character explain what happened. There's an even funnier example in a later issue, where there's a panel of a guy attacking a monster, and in the next panel they're both on the ground, and Ghost Rider goes, "Oh no, he slew the monster, and then it grasped him in its claw and it crushed him as he died." It's like, who are you even saying that to? The only other people there are the guy you're talking about and the dead monster. The rest of the Marvel Spotlight run doesn't really resemble anything in the movie. There's a dumb storyline where the adopted father is back alive under the guise of a guy called Curly, and he's also working for Satan and tries to kill Ghost Rider to come back alive. And the rest of the issues were just forgettable Freaks of the Week type stuff, where he fights a Native American guy called Snake Dance, and later his daughter, Witch Woman. There was no Blackheart character in the ones I read, and the entity that he made a deal with is called Satan, but they later retconned it that it was Mephisto posing as Satan. But the origin story I just regaled you with is largely intact in the Nicolas Cage movie. The movie just streamlines it a little bit. Instead of the father dying, the foster mother blowing up, and the foster father getting a disease, the movie conflates all that to just the father gets cancer, which I think is a lot less messy narratively than in the comic. Same goes for the way that they introduce Mephistopheles. Instead of Johnny immediately calling upon the devil, in the movie Mephistopheles instead approaches him, which I think makes a lot more sense. I feel like his demon senses were tingling and told him that somebody was desperate enough to make a bargain with him, and he took advantage of that. So let's get into the movie. You know, when watching Ghost Rider, I did feel a certain novelty about watching a pre-cinematic universe Marvel movie. Ghost Rider came out in 2007, a year before Iron Man, and before Marvel movies became the fine-tuned, mass-produced products that they are today, for better or for worse. In a way, there's something refreshing about the simpler times when you would watch a Marvel movie that isn't concerned about expanding the universe of the movie. And it doesn't waste time setting up characters that might someday appear in a Disney Plus spin-off show. That being said, I did watch all of the credits for Ghost Rider just in case Sam Jackson with an eye patch popped up at the end. Actually, on the topic of cameos and the distinction between MCU movies and non-MCU movies, was anybody else a little bit disappointed that Ghost Rider wasn't in Deadpool and Wolverine? It felt like the perfect opportunity for him to return. You could have had a joke where Deadpool sees him and goes, "Of course Nicolas Cage is here, that guy never turns down a role." But apparently an appearance from Nicolas Cage as Ghost Rider was considered. Ryan Reynolds said that it came to a conversation, but they ultimately decided no. And some people have taken that to mean that he might show up in Marvel's Secret Wars, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But back on the subject of things we usually get in an MCU movie, another thing we generally expect is a constant barrage of jokes and one-liners. And Ghost Rider doesn't really do that. There is a handful of jokes, and I think only one that actually made me laugh out loud.
Sterilize that for me.
Sterilize.
The boiling water.
Right.
But I think this movie might have benefited from a punchier script. I said earlier that the movie streamlines the origin story in comparison to the comic book, but the word streamline might have been a little bit generous in relation to the pacing. I watched the extended cut of the movie because I figured having more to talk about would make for a more interesting review, but I think this movie takes way too long to get going. We don't get to see the Ghost Rider until 50 minutes in. At least that's how long it took in the version I watched. But I think that's way too long, and the first act kind of drags. Especially the first part with the teenage Johnny Blaze. Those parts are really corny. And even once we get the Ghost Rider, it takes a while for him to start kicking ass. In his first action sequence, he gets hung by a chain, stuck in a puddle, and then immediately gets hit by a truck. I get that they need to show him struggling at the start in order to later have that build-up where he's able to fully master his powers. But it's almost a Wile E. Coyote level of mishaps at first. Some of the CGI in this movie is not great. And I guess some people would say that that's something it has in common with today's Marvel movies. With Ghost Rider, you can cut it some slack because it's 2007, but I think at the very least the Ghost Rider's skull head needs to be presentable. And it's not really, it's just kind of goofy looking. But honestly, some of the other instances of CGI in the movie are surprisingly good for 2007. A lot of the parts with him on the bike look kind of badass actually. I even did enjoy some of the action when it embraced the so dumb it's fun quality. Like when the bike drifts down the bridge, and when it drives vertically up and down a building. I also like when he treated the helicopter like Bowser in Mario 64. And I did get a kick out of the way he whistled for its bike and it came to him like a dog. I just wish that there was more fun moments like that, because the final fight of this movie is really lame. They do a weird monochrome thing, and some slow-mo, and then at one point Ghost Rider just kind of gives up and starts spamming projectiles at Blackheart. He's like a guy who just started playing Street Fighter and only knows how to do Hadouken. And then the villain becomes a nonsense CGI thing, and it's pretty cringy. So let's get into the cast and the characters, starting with Nicolas Cage, who plays Johnny Blaze. It's fairly well known that Nicolas Cage is a comic book fan, and he actually has a Ghost Rider tattoo that they had to cover up when he was in Ghost Rider. So dubious quality of this movie aside, good for Nicolas Cage that he got to play one of his favorite comic book characters, especially after that Tim Burton Superman movie famously fell apart. And even without knowing that Nicolas Cage was a fan of the character, I think that it's a role that he would have been attracted to anyway. An Elvis-inspired leather jacket-wearing motorbike rider with hellish superpowers. That seems pretty on brand for him. His performance as Johnny Blaze is pretty straight. He's alright in the role. He does have a southern drawl, which is always fun. I'm pretty sure that he downplays his performance as Johnny Blaze, to contrast with the insanity of the Ghost Rider parts, but I think he plays it a little bit too understated at times. Like when he's told that he's the devil's bounty hunter, he barely reacts.
Hey, thanks for the info. I feel much better now that I know I'm the devil's bounty hunter.
Or here's his reaction to getting arrested.
Captain Jack Dolan, this is Officer Edwards. You're coming with us.
Okay.
And here's his reaction to discovering that his friend has been brutally murdered.
Mac.
Now here's his reaction to a monkey doing martial arts.
Can I just turn this music off for a minute?
I mean, he is still Nicolas Cage after all. He does get a few quirky moments as Johnny Blaze, but most of his quirky moments are less in his performance and more in his character's interests, like watching chimps do karate on TV like I just mentioned, and also not wanting to be interrupted when he listens to the band The Carpenters. And my personal favorite is him eating jelly beans out of a martini glass. I can only assume that that was Nicolas Cage's suggestion, because who else would come up with that? So we've got this rock and roll motorcycle stuntman. What should his vice be? Booze? Drugs? No, just jelly beans in a glass. But we do kinda get a few Nicolas Cage freakouts in this movie during the transformation scenes, which are pretty fun. I would have loved to have seen a work print of that scene before they added in the special effects. So because of the whole conceit of the film, whenever he's in Ghost Rider form, we're not really seeing Nicolas Cage, we're seeing a skeleton man. Which is fine, that's the whole premise of the character. But at the very least, I kinda wish that his voice somewhat sounded like him.
Guilty. Look into my eyes.
I had to look up if that was even Nicolas Cage's voice because I didn't think it was him. Apparently Nicolas Cage's voice was filtered through animal growls and then played through a mechanical volumizer, whatever that is. But I really wish that they retained some of the Cageisms in his voice. I mean, Sam Elliott's Ghost Rider voice is still recognizable as Sam Elliott.
Stick to the shadows.
So let's talk about Sam Elliott in this movie. Sam Elliott plays a wise, old, mysterious exposition-delivering cowboy man, which I've gotta say is 10 out of 10 casting. You even have that classic Sam Elliott turn-of-phrase rhetorical question.
Who are you?
Question is, who are you?
Are you a ghost?
Am I?
What is happening right now?
He plays an amalgamation of that comic character I talked about earlier, Carter Slade, mixed with another Marvel character called the Caretaker. In the third act, there's meant to be a big twist reveal revelation that the Texas Ranger Devil's Bounty Hunter from 150 years ago that the Caretaker has been talking about this whole time is the Caretaker himself. But I'm not entirely convinced that Sam Elliott himself isn't some sort of century-spanning otherworldly cowboy, so it wasn't that much of a big reveal. Sam Elliott is legit pretty great in this movie, even though his dialogue is largely expository. And there's an awesome moment where after he reveals himself to be the previous Ghost Rider, he transforms and him and Johnny ride towards the location of the villain. We get the old and the new Ghost Rider riding alongside each other. Nicolas Cage on his flaming motorcycle, and Sam Elliott on a fiery steed in an homage to the painting Ghost Rider by David Mann, as the riff to the song Ghost Riders in the Sky plays in the background. It's pretty goddamn awesome. And then about 20 seconds later, after they ride together for a bit, Sam Elliott says that it's the end of his trail and that he only had one last transformation in him, and then he just fades away into the afterlife, leaving Nicolas Cage to go into the final confrontation alone. What the hell? They had the perfect setup for a cool showdown. Picture Ghost Rider's old and new arriving together for the final fight. Ghost Rider's in the sky kicks in. An old cowboy came riding down a dark and windy day. They can do some sweet combo moves together. Like Sam Elliott can string up the villain with an old-timey lasso. Then Johnny Blaze can combine that with his chain to try and pull the villain apart. You can even have a cool shot where the cowboy Ghost Rider on his horse jumps over Johnny Blaze on his motorbike. Then maybe Sam Elliott takes a mortal wound from the villain. And Sam Elliott says, "Well, kid, looks like it's time for you to take up the reins." And then he fades away into the afterlife. And now Johnny Blaze is fully realized as the spirit of vengeance. And he's extra pissed as he goes into the second phase of the showdown. Now that's how you give me a climax. And I mean that in every sense of the expression. But no, instead they just have Johnny Blaze go it alone into that boring CGI fest ending I talked about earlier. I can only assume that the budget couldn't support a fight scene with both Ghost Riders in it. But you don't know the blue balls I felt from having that teased and then taken away from me. Another cool bit of casting that's ultimately squandered is Peter Fonda as Mephistopheles. It is fun seeing Peter Fonda once again in a motorcycle-related movie after Easy Rider, and he gets a really cool introduction at the start. We see lights exploding as he walks through the carnival, and he stops briefly next to a cartoon painting of the devil. And we also get this fun part with his silhouette, but he's not in the movie for a big chunk. When he showed back up at the end of the movie, I was like, oh yeah, Mephistopheles was a whole thing in this. I completely forgot. It's just a bit of a shame that we don't really get to see him really do anything. But the main villain character Blackheart gets a lot more screen time, which is quite unfortunate because this guy sucks. I don't really think he fits the vibe of the film. The movie's going for like an old school Evel Knievel meets the Old West meets classic horror thing, and then you've got this guy looking like a Twilight character. They might have been going for like a Brandon Lee the Crow thing, and they tried to make him scary by doing a stupid spooky face jump scare thing a few times, but it just doesn't work, and even the actor's performance is not particularly good.
If you had trusted me, if you had given me what was rightfully mine,
It's all mine.
I'll bury him. And then I'll bury you, Father.
And also his goons are really lame too. They're these badly CGI'd elemental demons, and even the way they die is really dumb. Another character that I don't think really worked was Eva Mendes as Johnny Blaze's childhood sweetheart. Her performance is pretty bland, but I don't really blame Eva Mendes. It's a very thankless role and she's not given much to do at all. She's essentially the third act damsel in distress that the hero has to rescue. It's pretty cliche. There is a really weird moment when she's being stood up at the restaurant, and she asks a waiter if she's pretty, and the waiter is like, eh.
You think I'm pretty, right?
What is that waiter's problem? He must have the same taste in women as Will Ferrell and the other guys.
Get over here.
Not right now.
Okay.
Look, they're not all first-round picks, okay?
I will say, though, that I found her character more likable in the movie than in the few issues of the comic book I read. At least Eva Mendes didn't call Nick Cage a coward for no reason. So overall, this movie is I mean, it has its moments, and on paper there's a lot of cool concepts. Nick Cage as a stuntman turned devil's bounty hunter who makes a deal with a demonic Peter Fonda, and his mentor is a horse-riding otherworldly Sam Elliott. In theory, that should be a home run. But it's hampered by mediocre writing, an awful villain, poor pacing, and a criminally underused supporting cast. But like I said with National Treasure, if I watched this movie the year it came out, I probably would have loved it. I think 14, 15 is probably the perfect age for it, actually. So the next thing Nicolas Cage did was the 2007 movie Next. So until next time, guys, thanks for watching.